Hello, my name is Anthony Medella. I cover a wide range of topics as a senior staff correspondent for Positively Filipino. We invite you to keep coming back to our website to see the good work your Filipino sisters and brothers are doing in the world and support them with your time and friendship. This forum is coming to you through funding from the state of California, administered by the California State Library in partnership with the California Department of Social Services and California Commission on Asian and Pacific Islander American Affairs in conjunction with the Stop the Hate program. Positively Filipino is a grantee for 1 year during which we are posting stories that support this campaign. Okay, so now to the grave problem of anti-Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander hatred. Okay, anti-AAPI hate crimes can draw serious penalties because such bias-motivated crimes target individuals for being members of a group that's distinguishable by skin color or other immutable traits. An assault against one member is an assault against the wider community that the victim represents. In most states, once an arrest is made, the attention of the judicial system shifts to the alleged offender. The Sixth Amendment is one of 10 amendments that comprise the Constitution's Bill of Rights. The Sixth Amendment explicitly guarantees the criminal defendant the right to a public trial without unnecessary delay, the right to a lawyer, the right to an impartial jury, and the right to know who his or her accusers are and the nature of the charges and the evidence that led to the arrest. While we're all fans of due process, many Americans will agree that there should also be a constitutional amendment that guarantees crime victim rights. Victims' rights have scant legitimacy unless the crime is prosecuted in California, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Dakota, or Wisconsin. These states have adopted Marsy's Law or similar legislation, which assures the victim of certain rights in legal proceedings. The victim's rights guaranteed by Marsy's Law mitigate common anxieties that often discourage victims of anti-AAPI hate violence from reporting crimes to law enforcement. We are grateful to attorneys Quinn Ta and James Unger for advocating for Marsy's Law and coming here today to explain the law and why formal, explicit victims' rights are vital for an equitable justice system. And first, I would like to tell you more about our esteemed attorneys. Quinn Ta is a partner at the law firm of King & Spalding. She has been named a top 100 lawyer in California through her trial work in business disputes. Quinn is also a founding director of the Alliance for Asian American Justice. She was born and raised in San Jose, California, and is Vietnamese American. James Unger is a senior associate in trial and global disputes, also at King & Spalding. His clients range from Fortune 500 companies to startups and individual investors, and has worked closely with Quinn Ta on behalf of the Alliance for Asian American Justice. Quinn and James are eminently qualified to discuss and comment on the legal aspects of anti-AAPI hate incidents. We at Positively Filipino are privileged to have them here today.
So thank you so much for the very generous introductions. Again, my name is Quinton. We've litigated some hate crimes, AAPI hate crimes cases, and so we wanted to walk through some of basic information before we get into the interview. Marsy's Law has been very important for us and the Alliance for Asian American Justice in ensuring that Asian American victims of crime are protected. Marsy's Law was enacted in, and I won't go through the entire slide, but in California in 2008. It arose out of a very tragic criminal case where a young woman was murdered and her family was not aware of the consequences and how the case would turn out. And so this law was passed in order to expand the victim's rights under the Victim Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1982. And so what it means is that the victim's family usually has the right, and the victim too, to know about their case, to know about pleas. And Mr. Unger, who is my colleague, will speak to that. And there's been a nationwide effort to have Marsy's Law enshrined in various constitutions like California. There's similar laws in Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, and other states. And with that, I'm going to pass the second slide over to Mr. Unger.
So Marsy's Law gives victims of violent crime in California a number of important rights in terms of participation and to be informed regarding the progress of the case against the person who's alleged to have harmed them. One of those rights is to seek restitution, and that restitution is to be prioritized above other fines or financial penalties that the defendant may be asked to pay. And so a victim literally has a right to submit a form request for restitution as part of the sentencing, where if they've suffered harms, if they have hospital bills, if they have mental health bills, they can seek reimbursement for that. They also have a right, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but to attend and be heard at key points in the case, particularly when a plea bargain is reached, and then also at sentencing. The victim is not supposed to be left out of that and find out later that a lenient deal was reached. And they also have a right to be told when their attacker is being released on bail. That was a very tragic aspect of the Marsy case that led to Marsy's Law, was that the attacker was actually released on bail and the family was unaware and ran into him in the grocery store. So that kind of thing is not supposed to happen. And it is really up to prosecutors to keep individual victims informed as the case proceeds and to follow these procedures. But at the outset of the case, the prosecutor has to tell the victim of their Marsy's Law rights. And many DA's offices have this on their website or provide a card, stating what a victim's Marsy's Law rights are. And victims may not always read those or be aware of the importance of those, but they absolutely have a right to be told what their Marsy's Law rights are.
Now, in terms of challenges that to Marsy's Law, I mean, I can tell you that in bringing lawsuits, we did, which we can talk about further, we did bring a lawsuit against the former district attorney of San Francisco, where we said that there were federal violations, equal protection and others, because basically our view was the DA knew that Asian American victims of crime, many of them were elderly, monolingual, etc., were not able to represent themselves properly. And if they don't know about Marsy's Law, then obviously their cases are not going to get prosecuted. And so they were being treated differently than potentially the general population who are, who are victims of crime. So when we were bringing challenges, to sort of, these types of suits, I mean, there are, and I won't get into all the legal aspects, but standing, remedies, there's deference to law enforcement typically in these types of lawsuits. So these are all potential challenges in terms of Marsy's Law cases that, are based on that. I think in some ways were a case of first impression, but there were many sort of challenges that we thought through and that we were able to overcome. And ultimately, we didn't have to have a court adjudication or resolution because we were able to try to enter into negotiations. And then in our case, the district attorney was recalled, and we've been working very cooperatively with the current district attorney of San Francisco. Next slide. The Alliance for Asian American Justice is an organization that we work very closely with. And it's an organization that was started due to COVID. And the founders are a group of general counsels of Fortune companies and law firm partners like myself and colleagues like James Unger, who decided to come together because we are the best lawyers in the country and we bill at the highest billable rates. But we know that when the community needs us, when there are areas of vulnerability, we would be the best equipped in the country with the most resources to help our victims. And so the Alliance for Asian American Justice is now, we've now been around for like 3 to 4 years. Unfortunately, there's still lots of hostility and hate crimes being perpetrated against Asians and many minority groups, anti-Semitism, etc. So we are still very much alive, functioning, and working continuously with our local governmental agencies.
So I want to talk briefly about a particular case that we brought on behalf of a Vietnamese American man named Anh Le. In this case, the Alliance thought it was important, and it was, I think, a great thing that Mr. Le could have fellow Vietnamese American counsel, Ms. Ta as lead counsel, and also a former colleague of ours, Luan Tran, was involved. But we also had a team from our firm, really an all-star team, including McGregor Scott, who's the former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of California, as well as Will Mosley, who was a in-house at a client of ours and a close colleague. And we all worked collaboratively to represent Mr. Le. Mr. Le was attacked in Chinatown in San Francisco in 2019 by a family. An entire family basically participated in this attack and harassment of Mr. Le. And it was an extremely traumatic event for him. And it turned out that this group of individuals had attacked 2 other people the same day. And they were ultimately, one of them, the adult male, was ultimately arrested and charged with attacking Mr. Le. But then basically Mr. Le later found out that the district attorney's office reached a very lenient plea agreement with no jail time with the one of the multiple people who attacked him who was ultimately charged with a crime. So he did, his attacker did plead guilty to a crime, but he received a very lenient plea. And this was obviously very upsetting and distressing to Mr. Le. It's not something he would have agreed to. He didn't have a chance to be heard by the court. And so when he came to us, he was really suffering from the feeling of being unheard, as well as the traumatic consequences of the attack, feeling like the system really didn't care that he had suffered this injury. And so what we were able to do for him was to both call out and challenge the way the DA's office had handled this case through the federal lawsuit that Ms. Ta mentioned regarding his Marsy's Law rights, and also to look more systemically, which Ms. Ta will talk about, at other cases in San Francisco that we felt had not been handled properly. We also filed a lawsuit against Mr. Le's attackers, and we conducted a mediation under the supervision of a former judge in San Francisco. And at that mediation, his attackers actually apologized to him, which I think was quite meaningful to him, and agreed to stay away from him in the future. And just, I think it was day before yesterday, a court in San Francisco granted him a 5-year restraining order against his attackers, which I also think was important for his peace of mind going forward. So I think the takeaway from Mr. Le's case is that when individuals have counsel and when individuals are willing to stand up and say what happened to me wasn't right, the outcomes of those cases can often be very different.
In closing, there's just 2 other examples. I mean, I didn't want to go in depth into them, but there's 2 matters, Vika Ratanapadki and also Bronson Liao. Both of them were also victims of AAPI hate crimes in San Francisco. Grandpa Vika, he's fondly being known as, he passed away. He was pushed, unfortunately. And so I think his case against the defendant is still making its way through the courts. And then Mr. Ronchin Liao was 80-something years old, did talk to our client, Mr. Lay, as well. And he was sitting in a walker waiting for the bus when he got kicked, fell backwards, was in the hospital for 2 or 3 days. He's become so despondent. My understanding from the news is he's moved back to China. But these are also other cases that, we've been, we in the past were speaking to their lawyers, and that's when we saw the pattern in practice in the last administration in the San Francisco DA's office, where we felt like the cases were not being fully prosecuted and the victims were not fully aware of their Marsy's Law's rights. And so we wanted to mention those because ours, weren't the only cases. And I know that there are still hate crimes. And fortunately, the current district attorney, Brooke Jenkins in San Francisco, is very vigilant and is working closely with the Alliance for Asian American Justice. And with that, we are done with sort of the background so that we can answer the questions that will be posed to us appropriately.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Unger and Ms. Ta. So Ms. Ta, I understand that you brought a case seeking to apply Marsy's Law. Every violent crime victim should be entitled to understand and participate in the prosecution of those who have harmed them. Are police officers and prosecutors that ratified Marsy's Law sufficiently aware of the unique concerns involved in an anti-AAPI hate incident following the pandemic?
That's a really good question, and I thank you for asking it. I think that for us, our view was that the police officers certainly were very much trying to work with the victims of crime, and they were, very sympathetic. And I'm talking about San Francisco, right? Because that's our experience. Our victims certainly felt like the police officers were allies, but prior to DA Jenkins' administration, when they got to the DA's office, they were not sufficiently being told about Marsy's Law. And the thing that, we wanted to emphasize too is that unfortunately, these hate crimes and these acts of hostility and violence were being perpetrated against the most vulnerable, elderly, and many who didn't even speak English. And so you have to have also culturally competent victims' rights advocates in the DA's office to be able to talk about Marsy's Law, right? And to tell the victims and to explain to them, you have a court hearing, you have a right to be there. Here is when, the victim can speak. Would you and your family members or whomever, would you like to put in a victim impact statement? Then, let's say you talk through the criminal process, you have to explain all that. And in our view, in the last administration, which was our experience, these victims from this community were not sufficiently told about Marsy's Law. Okay, so that's why the lawsuit was brought. And I think that, to Mr. Unger's point, we have seen change because we've been working with the DA's office. The courts became aware of this. So the courts now have ways to address this by asking the DA before a plea deal gets entered, DA so-and-so, has the victim been told about this plea deal? Does the victim wish to be heard? Those questions from the court themselves, if the DA's office is unable to help our victims vindicate their rights under Marsy's Law, that is also another safeguard. And those were things that the Alliance for Asian American Justice, along with our legal team, has been very intently focused on.
Yeah, so before Marsy's Law, the victim was primarily represented by the DA's office, and there was no lawyer representing the victim. Is that the way it used to be?
No, to be clear, typically victims are not represented, okay? Typically, this is the problem with the issue of victims not knowing their rights. In the case of our client, we saw this become an issue, and, he was put in touch with us through the Alliance for Asian American Justice. Typically, in the criminal justice system, when you are a victim, right, the DA is supposed to represent the people of California, for instance, in our state. The DA and their sort of victims' rights advocates, et cetera, they are not representing the victim per se. They are representing the people. But They are the ones typically charged with telling the victim their rights. The victims are essentially the witnesses for these cases. They're the main victim, right? But it's the people of California typically versus whomever defended. So before Marsy's Law, I don't think that it was written anywhere where the victims had a Bill of Rights that they need to know about their case, et cetera. And because of this very tragic case, that became enshrined in our Constitution.
Okay, thank you. How does Marsy's Law assure AAPI victims that law enforcement and the judicial system will represent their interests in a society that may still perceive AAPI individuals in a disadvantageous manner?
Yeah, so as I touched on briefly earlier, having Marsy's Law is really important because then it ensures that the victims, let's say, look, if the DA is doing his or her job, then the victims should be told of all their rights. They should be, like as the process moving along, as I described, they should be aware of all the court hearings, that they could go in and tell the judge all these things. And the thing is that when that fails, right, then what do you have to turn to? We were always worried about that process. And so now, at least in San Francisco, where we're working with the DA's office, they're very much intent upon providing the victims with an understanding of their rights. But as I spoke about, because of all of our court hearings for Mr. Lay, we did fortuitously have one hearing before Judge Masula, who is the presiding judge in San Francisco. And she has now, to ensure as a double measure, as I noted, she now has questions that in the Hall of Justice, which is the criminal judges in San Francisco, they have to read out to the DA to ensure that Marsy's Law is met.
Okay, thank you. You may have answered part of this question, but in regard to what to expect when you report a crime, Ms. Ta, can you please describe the legal process that typically follows an arrest or citation for bias-centric violence, injury, or property damage?
I'm going to turn this to Mr. Unger. Can you handle that question, Mr. Unger?
Yes, of course. So when a person is a victim of a crime and contacts the police will make a report and they may make an arrest. And if someone is arrested, then the case will be assigned to a prosecutor. And the individual who's arrested has a right to a defense lawyer. And if they can't afford a defense lawyer, they'll be provided one through the public defender's office. As Ms. Ta mentioned, the victim doesn't have a right to have an attorney. And so many times they're not aware of their own rights. But after an arrest is made, this is a critical stage of the case. And many victims might assume that the case is going to go on for a long time. But at times, these cases resolve early through what's called a plea agreement, where the defendant agrees to plead guilty to a crime in exchange for a lesser punishment. Under Marsy's Law, the prosecutor has to consult with the victim before this happens, and the victim has a right to be there, as I mentioned, and to state their view so that the judge can take that into account when deciding whether to accept the plea agreement and how to sentence the attacker. So, that is a absolutely critical stage, and it is important for an individual who is the victim of a crime to know that that may happen, and that if the prosecutor tries to contact them about that, that's a very important thing, that they take that opportunity, if it's important to them, to be heard by the system in that case. If the case is not resolved through a plea bargain, oftentimes to try the case effectively, the prosecution will need the victim to be a witness. And that's obviously a difficult experience for many victims. It can be very frightening for them to face the person who hurt them, but it can also be critical in making sure that the person who hurt them is punished and doesn't hurt others. And the thing that I want to emphasize is that victims need to know they have rights in this process. They're not supposed to be an outsider to the process. That's what Marsy's Law is about. They have a real role to play, and it can be part of their recovery and of restoring a feeling of safety. But the system needs to listen to the victim, even when it's easier to treat the obligations under Marsy's Law as a box to check. We really want to emphasize to prosecutors that is the wrong approach, particularly in cases that involve hate crimes, where, you know, there is often an additional emotional impact on the victim, and feeling unheard by the system can actually, in some cases, sort of re-victimize the victim and make them feel more marginalized as a result of their status. And it is in those cases that it's especially important that prosecutors really be careful to involve the victim in the case and make sure they understand what's happening and have a chance to speak to the court if they object to how the case is being handled or resolved.
Thank you. If biased crimes are difficult to prosecute, why should victims report a crime and engage in what may be a losing cause?
That's a good question. And we saw that firsthand in some of our investigation, you know, when we went out to see, for instance, Mr. Lay or wherever we see other victims in nursing homes, they often express that same concern. Why should I go report if it's so difficult, right? And they have a good point, because they have to they get re-victimized every time they report. And then if the DA is not you know, willing to prosecute, then it feels like you're re-victimizing for no reason at all. And so I think that's why it's really important to have organizations like the Alliance to work with the DA to make sure that the victim feels like he or she is heard. Because when that happens, like Mr. Lay's case, you know, it really got things moving such that the institutions were able to come together, you know, the mayor's office. I'm just using San Francisco as an example because that's where our case was. The mayor's office, as well as the DA's office, as well as the chief of police, as well as the city attorney, they all came together to have stronger protections for Asian American victims of crime, given the you know, the uptick, the incredible and unfortunate uptick of crimes against victims. And so the simple answer is, look, when victims of crime do speak up, like Mr. Lay, and in our case, we were also involved, and we were very lucky that, you know, he was a victim that was being represented by us, who was a member of the Alliance. We were then able to make greater social change to then give victims of crime even more protection. It's not always the case that this is happening, but that's why we've been as visible as we have in terms of our legal team and the Alliance for Asian American Justice, so that victims know that when they speak up, not only is there accountability for their case, but there is accountability for other victims of crime. And so I know that Mr. An Lay, who is our client, that is why he spoke up at great expense to himself, re-victimizing himself constantly because he has to speak about his experience so that this would not happen to other victims of crime.
Yeah, and oftentimes, you know, if a crime like this takes place, it seems that the justice system seems to be more concerned about rehabilitating the defendant than the, you know, the aftermath as far as what the victim experiences. So you spoke a little about restitution, like what is likely to happen, you know, if a victim does suffer emotional damage, injuries, or property damage, or physical injuries to the victim after a case is resolved.
James, you want to take this? Because I know you've been dealing with the remedial stage for a long time.
Sure. So that's a very good question. And I think it's a difficult issue in that, you know, oftentimes someone who commits a crime, they may not have resources where, you know, restitution can be imposed upon them, but they may not have money to pay to remediate the harm. And, you know, certainly you can also bring a civil suit as a victim. If somebody has attacked you, that's not just a crime, it's also what we call a tort, which is a civil wrong. But again, it really, in a lot of ways, depends on the person's ability to pay. And there are some funds available, public funds, to assist victims who have been harmed, but they're pretty limited. So, you know, for a lot of people, that's a difficult part of moving on with their life is, hey, I've suffered, and, you know, how do I receive compensation for this? And I think, you know, to the extent that there are funds available, there are things available within the system. It's really important that individuals, to the extent they can, be their own advocate. And that when they can't, that organizations like the Alliance and other groups out there are there, because the system can be really difficult to navigate, especially when someone has barriers to access like language or cultural barriers. And so it's just very important in those cases, for people to not expect that the prosecutors or the system will otherwise guide them to what they deserve to help them get past these attacks.
Thank you. We're in an election year and are hearing distorting rhetoric laying blame for economic ills and the coronavirus on Asian communities. When a hate crime occurs, is the legal process likely to be lenient toward a defendant who was unduly influenced by respected voices in society?
I mean, look, it's a really hard question. I mean, I think that there's a lot of macro issues at play. As you mentioned, Anthony, I mean, the larger issues of blaming Asian Americans or whomever, right, for COVID, that type of rhetoric is extremely, extremely harmful. On the other hand, as you talk about leniency on defendants and all of that, what I'm reminded of is our system requires balance. It really does. Our system requires looking at both the victim's story and the defendant's story. I think when that is what our judicial system, certainly the criminal justice system, is trying to achieve, right? And if the DA does his or her job and the public defender does his or her job and the judge looks at everything, that is when I think, we can be assured that victims' rights are protected as well as defendants' rights. I mean, I think both James and I and the Alliance for Asian American Justice, we all understand that unfortunately the criminal justice system is such that there is mass incarceration of people of color. That is extremely unfortunate, and we recognize that. But I do want to say that when you have a balance on both ends, that's when we can be assured that there is balance, right? And so it's not about, okay, there's going to be leniency on the defendants or we're going to only listen to the victims. What we saw in our case was the imbalance where the victims' rights weren't even being represented. And so now the judge, at least Judge Masulo, and I give her such great credit for seeing the issues because we were fortuitously in front of her for one of the hearings. She has now put safeguards in place where before a plea deal is approved of by the court, because the court has to approve that plea deal if someone has been charged, she can ask the district attorney, have you spoken to the victim about this plea deal and are they okay about it? It's not just about, oh, the defendant agrees to it, the DA agrees to it. No, the victim needs to also know about it. And would they like to speak? Because if the victim feels like it's too lenient, he or she should have the ability to articulate his or her concerns. So, I think in the larger question, which you raised very articulately, it's a complex set of issues. But I do think that in the end of the day, when there is balance in the criminal justice process, I think it leads to the best possible result.
Yeah. Ms. Ta and Mr. Unger, based on your experience, are you optimistic that Marsy's Law is a preliminary step toward approval of a national victims' rights amendment in the future?
I'll defer to Mr. Unger because I give him very much credit for being a large and significant member of our team. He did a lot of research on Marsy's Law, and we are hopeful for larger change, and that's why we're working with the Alliance for Asian American Justice. But I'll turn it to Mr. Unger to answer that question.
Yeah, I hope so. I do think Marsy's Law has been important in our case as a tool for advocacy for victims. And I do think that it's something that could make an impact, has made an impact in other states and could make an impact nationally. I also think it's only one aspect of recognizing that, the problem of the uptick in hate crimes against Asian Americans, particularly, and that there are a variety of people I know in Congress and in various state legislatures working on those issues, because it is no less serious for someone to be attacked and injured because of their national origin In fact, it is more so as recognized by our law in a number of cases, because that is a hate crime, and hate crimes are often difficult to prove. You'll hear from prosecutors that unless somebody says, I am doing this because of this person's race or national origin, it is difficult to prove and get that sentencing enhancement that may be available in theory for those kinds of crimes. But we need to be vigilant and be advocates for making sure that all the tools are available to prosecutors and that victims have all the tools available to them to advocate for themselves, to make sure that these cases are handled appropriately, because it's an incredibly serious issue and it's been really tragic to see in this country in the past few years.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Unger, Ms. Ta, on behalf of Positively Filipino, we appreciate your willingness to discuss Marcy's Law and the, I guess, proliferation of hate crimes involving that AAPI communities in the country. And do you have any additional remarks you'd like to make on the subject?
No, I mean, from my end, obviously, I would like to thank my client, Mr. Onlay, who was brave enough to step up, willing to speak about his experiences, and really being further victimized and having to talk about his experiences and re-experiencing, the humiliation of being a victim of crime. And then what we learned during the process is feeling a deep sense of, and in the victims' rights community, they talk about institutional betrayal, having the district attorney's office at the time with the current administration not even making him aware of where his case was, and then settling it without his knowledge, really made him feel like there was no accountability. So I wanted to thank my clients and obviously the Alliance for Asian American Justice, and for my legal team that really, including Mr. Unger, as well as my client Applied Materials. It was a real strong collaboration and coalition of individuals and organizations that has led to some positive results in San Francisco and San Francisco County. And my hope is that it doesn't stop with San Francisco. So we also thank Positively Filipino for providing the spotlight of this issue. We look to further collaborations. And I'll turn to Mr. Unger to close us out.
Sure, and I just echo that. I'd like to thank Mr. Lay for his courage. He has been through an awful lot to bring these issues to light, and to let his case be an example for other cases. And I really want to recognize that bravery. And I also want to say thank you to Quinn and to the Alliance for Asian American Justice for the opportunity to be involved in this important work. It's really been a privilege.
The Alliance for Asian American Justice, is that an organization whose members are only attorneys, or can other people support it as well?
I am sure we are very inclusive in terms of membership. I mean, it was started quite frankly due to necessity. And the people that got involved right away, we figured would be lawyers. But, we meet from time to time. We try to collaborate across the country, across law firms and across the corporate community. But I am certain that, if anyone wants to join and they want to learn more about the Alliance for Asian American Justice, we would be quite happy to welcome anyone who's interested in these issues. We are now a 501c3 as well. And, we remain one of the more active sort of organizations, at least on the front lines, dealing with the legal issues.
Thank you. And thank you for being here today. And you really provided quite a bit of insight, and your comments really are going to help our 180,000 readers around the world, but primarily in the United States and the West Coast. So, Positively Filipino will definitely would like to be more involved with what your organization is doing in helping you promote the cause, because it's a difficult period for our communities. And, I'm not going to say it's not going to get better, but right now, I've spoken with law enforcement, and they've said, well, the numbers have actually gone down. But the truth is, quite a number of people don't report the crimes, and that's what the issue is. Not so much that in my case, the LAPD, only saw 16 cases of Asian American API crime incidents that were reported. But then, a third of Asian Americans who have been polled about whether they've ever suffered an incident have said that they have suffered, that it has occurred in their lives, but they didn't report it. So I'm glad that you were able to clarify things and that people should come forward and the consequences aren't severe, for coming forward, that there aren't really these terrible risks because, if the perpetrator is still out in the streets, that they're still at risk of being injured by that person. So something has to be done. And I'm glad that Marcy's Law and you're here to really look out for us. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. We really appreciate the time.